Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Mercedes have responded to Lewis Hamilton's concerns that the car is bouncing again at the Belgian Grand Prix. They don't believe that it was related to the brand new set of updates, but actually think it was a more circuit specific or setup related issue that they can dial out for the next Grand Prix after the summer break. Will that fill him with too much confidence though, given that the team doesn't still seem to fully understand how their car is going to perform? Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. First of all, a crazy story with regard to AlphaTauri. We saw yesterday that the rumour has it they are going to rename to Hugo Boss. So they're going to partner with another fashion brand, and so Red Bull can maximise cash, basically. Now, the name of this team is not going to be, I don't know, Boss F1 or Hugo Boss Racing, but apparently they're going to go for Hugo Boss Bulls Racing. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know why this sounds so ugly. I don't know why they need to put the bulls in there, because it doesn't sound great, does it? This is at least my perspective. Clearly they want to have the Red Bull component in there, I guess, so that they can maximize the brand power, but still, come on, like, at least make it sound good. So yeah, that's the current rumor. Hugo Boss Bulls Racing is what it's going to be called. It sounds so bad, but it's early days. It might not even be with Hugo Boss, but that's the present rumor, and apparently they're going for that. So I'm not a fan of it, but yeah, no more AlphaTauri. It's definitely changing to something or other. It might be this. I guess in that circumstance, people are just going to call them Hugo Boss, really, aren't they? So I guess it doesn't really matter what the full team name is, just because, you know, Mercedes and Mercedes AMG Petronas Formula 1 team or whatever, and Aston Martin, like, you know, Aston Martin Cognizant, or whatever it is, right? Nobody says the whole thing anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. People just go by the nicknames. There is another big rumor emerging, and I can't imagine this is true or going to happen, but Crofty talked about it in the Sky Sports F1 podcast, so, you know, it's obviously got some merit behind it as a paddock rumour at the very least, that AlphaTauri, or Hugo Boss Bulls Racing, are planning to run the RB19 as their car next year. This is, I don't know if this is legal. I can't imagine that it is. And the teams, I'm sure, would protest if it was the case, but the rules for this year and next year are the same. The RB19 will fit next year's regulations just as next year's RB20 will, which is going to be even faster than this year's RB19. But the RB19 is so good that, and it has kind of happened before, where Super Aguri, as is mentioned here, has run a year-old Honda. So maybe it's possible for, given the relationship there between Hugo Boss Bulls Racing and Red Bull, to use the RB19 as next year's car for the sister team, while the main team runs the RB20. Surely this isn't legal anymore, and if it is, surely the other teams are going to say, no, hang on a second here, like, there's something not right about this, because we know what happened with Tracing Point and all this, right, where they copied the Mercedes of the previous year. But if it's actually just straight up the same car, and Yuki Tsunoda's, you know, bagging it into P1 on the first weekend of the season, then, you know, we might have a really different story on our hands. So I doubt that's going to happen, but I just wanted to mention it because it's a very interesting rumour, and I'm not too familiar with the rules to say whether this is allowed or not, to be perfectly honest. There's also been some big talking points from Pirelli. They actually admitted the other day that George Russell said their tyres are useless, or the wet tyres are useless, and they actually agreed and said, yeah, our wet tyres are useless, because right now, you can't use them. It seems like even in qualifying, you don't really want to use the wets because the track conditions, they just prefer for it to dry up. And even on a wet track, it still feels like the inters are faster, just the nature of the compounds. And you can't race on the wets because if the conditions mandate wet tyres, then the conditions are bad enough to require a safety car, and you're not really going to race in those conditions. So the wet tyres are kind of useless as it stands, and they only ever drive on the inters in wet conditions. And that's obviously not ideal. Pirelli have proposed a new super intermediate or intermediate plus tyre to address these issues. So that's their plan, but there also are some thoughts as to whether Pirelli will even remain in Formula 1 going forward. They're going to be in the sport at least until the end of 2024, but from 25 onwards, they have to renegotiate their deal. And Bridgestone have also applied to be the manufacturer for 2025 onwards. And I think most fans would agree that I don't think Pirelli's done a great job with these compounds. Maybe Bridgestone could do better, maybe they couldn't, but I don't think people are massive fans of Pirelli generally, and I know a lot of people want to see a tyre war, right? I don't think that's going to happen, and they're going to have both, but they will choose one or another. So Pirelli can produce competent, reasonably competent tyres. Bridgestone apparently has offered more money. So this is for F1 to consider. Pirelli is considered the favourite, and a couple of weeks ago the rumour was that Pirelli had been selected and it was a done deal, unlike Bridgestone, although many would like to see them back. But the reports are of today that it's not necessarily set in stone yet. So that's definitely a big one. But let's talk some of these teams then. So Aston Martin have regressed somewhat. There was a rumour the other day that actually brought too much downforce in Canada, and it was affecting their car for the negative. And it aligns a little bit, that explanation, with what Mercedes have said, because they've said they're trying to introduce more downforce and put more performance on the car, but they turn up to Spa and all of a sudden their car's bouncing again, which makes you think whether it's had adverse consequences, their latest updates. But from Zandvoort, Aston Martin are bringing more things. They apparently have plenty of budget left in the tank, as do Mercedes. They explain their perspective in the video. Mike Elliott goes through, discusses why the bouncing came back, what they think caused it, and all the updates they're going to bring it to not necessarily address the bouncing if it's circuit and setup specific, but just going forward in the season in general.
Why has the bouncing come back, and how much is it affecting the performance of the cars? We definitely had an amount of bouncing this weekend. Both drivers were telling us that, and we could see it in the data. We could also see an amount of bouncing on the other cars, and I think some of it is the nature of the circuit at Spa, and in fact we had huge amounts of bouncing last year, as did most teams. In terms of the performance, it definitely affects the performance of the cars because it affects the driver's ability to extract the maximum grip from the car, it affects their balance, and it affects their ability to get their braking points, etc. right. So that's definitely something we'll be working on for the future. The question we need to ask ourselves is how much of it is just the circuit we're at in the Spa and how much is it to be found in setup? Because obviously it was a wet race weekend, a weekend where we had no dry running up until the point we were actually racing. We'll also take a really good look at the upgrade kit and make sure we've not introduced bouncing with that, but at the moment our belief is it's probably a result of setup or the circuit itself. I think in terms of the race pace, I think that is all about degradation, and to get the degradation you want, you've got to have the balance in exactly the place you want it. For us this weekend we weren't there, and I think that's just a result of not having dry laps in practice, not having enough opportunity to get the setup of the car just where you want it, and relatively we ended up with a car that wasn't quite as well balanced as maybe some of our competitors were, and as a result we had more tyre degradation and therefore weren't really able to extract the sort of race pace that we would like to have seen. What work is going to be done during the summer break, and what can we expect for the second half of the season? Well, if we start with the summer break, we can't do very much at all. We're not allowed to by regulation. We're forced to take a 2-week break with no development of the cars, and I think for most of the factory that's going to be a well-needed break, something that actually probably helped them in the second half of the season when we need to bring all of that energy, bring all the upgrades we possibly can to the car. In terms of what we can expect from the second half of the season, we need to keep pushing. We need to keep pushing because we want to learn more about this car so we can take that into the winter and into the development of next year's car. But also we want that fight for that second in the championship. So we'll keep bringing some upgrades to the car, keep fighting for that second position.
So Spa was a massive circuit for this last season, and what I find quite fascinating at Spa is that if you looked at the cars going up Eau-Rouge and Raidillon, the Red Bulls were sparking the most, which sounds to me that they're running closest to the ground. Ride height perspective, the Red Bull is right on the floor. The Mercedes, I think, were just behind. I think Kim Illman talked about this when he was photographing the events, that the Red Bulls were sparking the most, then the Mercedes. So the Mercedes are being pretty aggressive with their ride height, and it might have been introducing the porpoising issue back onto their car, which they definitely suffered with, and it caused the consequences of, just mega lacking pace. Their car is probably a lot quicker if they didn't have that issue. Now, when you've got 1 hour in wet, mixed conditions on a Friday to set up your car for the whole weekends, you're unlikely to nail it, especially when you've brought a big upgrade on the weekend, right? New side pod design, new floor edge, new rear wing in Hamilton's case. So getting it right for Mercedes was going to be a challenge in that short period of time with all those conditions. So they're probably right to think, well, we might just have got the setup wrong, and on a different track it'll be better, and it might well be. But we hear this in Mercedes quite a lot, where they seem to think one thing and then they turn up to the next weekend and actually they realise that there's another problem they've introduced that they didn't realise they initially had. So Mercedes are confident that it's probably just a setup thing and a circuit specific thing that they can dial out with certain suspension setups and ride height and all this stuff, and they will have more performance elsewhere. So Toto Wolff is thinking it could be something to do with the floor, and therefore they might have to change the floor going forwards, and they might have something like that on the way anyway. But yeah, definitely, probably, well, it's a good sign what Mercedes are saying for their performance, that they don't think their upgrade caused this issue. They think they might have suffered from this anyway, had they have had the same setup with the previous version of the car that they presently do, and they were roughly 8/10 off the pace of Max Verstappen. But there was even analysis done that Max was losing about half a second a lap by lifting up Eau Rouge and Raidillon. So Max could have gone, they reckon, half a second faster, and he was already 8/10 faster than the Mercedes and the Ferraris, and he started from P6. So that's the kind of thing that these other teams are dealing with right now in terms of performance gap in race situations. But the other piece, of course, was the additional upgrades they're bringing to the car. They are still committed, and I think they'll get P2 kind of at a canter now. It seems to me that way, at least, because Ferrari, they might be able to do something, but even if the Ferrari had a great car, imagining that team's going to overtake Mercedes with strategy and just the volatility of that team seems doubtful. Aston Martin have fallen back right now, and McLaren have a big gap to make up on Mercedes. So I think the Mercedes could probably not do much and still get P2. They've got the drivers for it, but they still want to get second in the constructors. You could argue, oh no, you want to get third to get more testing time, but they want the money. You know, they want to go from third to second, right, and then try and win it next year, I guess would be the plan. But meanwhile, Red Bull are saying for pretty much the first time that their goal now is to win all the races. I remember at the start of the season when George Russell said after one race in Bahrain, he said, Red Bull will win every race this season. And everyone, he said, no, George, you're saying it, it's ridiculous. Like, what are you talking about? And, you know, we don't know if that's true yet. And at the time, Helmut Marko was like, oh, it's way too early to say anything like that. But now we're halfway through the season, Helmut Marko is saying, yeah, the goal's to win all of them, which of course it is. I mean, they've won half of them, so they might as well go to win all of them now. But still, they are first, you know, it's kind of the first time Red Bull have said, yeah, like, we can pretty much definitely do this. They've won all the sprint races as well, right? And there's 6 sprint races this year for them to still get those victories as well, which would be just ridiculous if that's the case. Just one more quick thing. You guys probably know Pato O'Ward and Alex Palou, current drivers in the IndyCar side, who will be doing free practice sessions for McLaren sometime later this year again. I think both of them were in the McLaren last year, and Alex Palou has actually been linked to the AlphaTauri, or shall we say, like, whatever it is, Hugo Boss Bulls Racing, whatever it's going to be called. Like, he's been linked to that seat a little bit and is currently pretty much dominating the IndyCar Championship. And I agree with Zach Brown that these guys definitely have Formula 1 potential, and would be, especially Alex Palou has been so impressive in IndyCar that I'd love to see him get a seat next year in Formula 1 if a team wants to go for that. But they will be getting some practice sessions to put themselves in the car. So very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.